The Great Depression of the United States. What was it? Who was affected? And how did it start? The Great Depression of the United States was caused by the weakness on the U.S. economy. Although the 1920s was known as a prosperous time, the income was not evenly distributed, meaning that the rich people made large profits and people spent much more money from what they earned. But for many Americans, the Great Depression started after the crash of the stock market or Black Thursday in October 24, 1929. On this date, over 16 million shares of stocks were sold by the investors that had lost faith in the American economy. The crash marked the beginning of the widespread and long-lasting consequences for the United States. Unemployment. In 1930, sale prices got low. Interest rates had dropped to a low level. By May 1930, automobile sales had declined to below the levels of 1928. Prices in general began to decline. Then a deflationary spiral started in 1931. The conditions were worst in farming areas, where prices plunged, and also in mining and logging areas. The unemployment was high, and there were few other jobs. This made the Great Depression worst. There were fewer and fewer jobs left over, and people had no more money to spend. In 1933, the unemployment level reached 25% of the U.S. population. Hoover's government seemed to do little to help the people in need. In 1930, a huge wave of unemployed Protestants created a riot on the streets of New York, forcing the police to take proper action of the situation. In Source 1, page 91, we can see how the policeman is fighting with the infuriated Protestants. This is a reliable source because we have a photographic evidence of what happened during the riot. This picture is credible because we can see the brutality and the seriousness of the situation. Roosevelt during the Great Depression. Dissatisfied with President Hoover's economic programs, the people elected Franklin Roosevelt as their president in 1932. Roosevelt was well known as an experimenter and as a man of action. Early on his administration, he assembled the best minds of the country to advise him. This group of men were known as the Brain Trust. Within 100 days, the president and his advisors, and also the U.S. Congress, passed into law a package of legislation designed to help lift the troubled nation out of the Depression.
Today, I will be talking about the rich people in the Great Depression. While many of the richest people in America lost money when the stock market crashed, the rich people as a whole still retained much of the wealth which they had held before the Depression, and in most cases did not suffer from unemployment. Working class Americans, many of whom were thrown out of the work by the Depression, were shocked and angered by this display of wealth. The rich people, on the other hand, began to resent their social inferiors even more than ever, particularly after the institution of a number of New Deal programs, which were paid for our taxes on those who still had an income. They often viewed such programs as handouts, which, as can be seen in the cover, were not something which the rich people felt was their responsibility to provide. They were angry by the actions of President Roosevelt, who catered to the mass of Americans while largely ignoring the interests of the rich people. These factors served to heighten class tensions during a period when many Americans, both rich and poor, were already tense over the financial features. Some rich people at that time was baseball star Babe Ruth, who made $80,000 a year in those days; John Dillinger, who raked in more than $3 million in today's dollars; Phil Starr, James Cagney, one of the top money makers in Hollywood in the 1930s; Charles Darrow, creator of the Monopoly game, who became the world's first millionaire. I would be talking to you about the source 4. This source content appeared to be quite genuine. For instance, the good part is that some rich people had enough money to maintain themselves and donate to poor ones, but the problem was that the rich people only thought about themselves, that they kept their money just for them. The source content appeared to be overly one-sided. For example, the rich remained rich during the Depression. This source gives an account from someone who was close to the event. For example, it may have been a friend or family of John D. Rockefeller, Although they were close to what happened, that they have been involved, caught up in the events, and only give evidence from their perspective. For instance, the quantity of money they have. The source is designed to inform without any bias. Favoritism, for example. They are saying the truth that some people got a lot of money when others don't have a cent. The source content corresponds with the other evidence and another source such as source 6, that is, shown in the PowerPoint. The source seemed to disagree, conflict, with source 7, that is, on the PowerPoint too. So, for rich people, the depression didn't affect the most of them. In fact, they had better opportunities because in their jobs they had less workers. So, the ones left earned more. The rich people got richer, and instead of helping the poor people and immigrants, they just had to save the money for themselves.
Immigrants, reasons for leaving their country and going to the United States. Political freedom, religious tolerance, economic opportunity, people want a better life, better job, and more money. Political refugees, fear for their lives. Some want free atmosphere, forced immigration, and family reunification. Many reasons for letting them go to the United States, but they didn't know that immigration was a thorny issue. During the Great Depression, a lot of people tried to enter the United States, but the government declined the entry. Legislation was already in place, barring certain ethnic groups from entering the United States, and immigration remained restricted during the era owing to economic factors. Many refugees escaping from the Nazi persecution. Beginning in the 1880s, natives who favored the interests of native-born Americans over those immigrants succeeded in securing legislation that restrict immigration. The first legislation directed against a specific group, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers into the United States, and it was not until 1943 that the act was repealed. Before the Great Depression, immigrants from other countries came to the USA. In fact, historians recognize three major immigrant movements in the United States. These include the first period between 1815 to 1860, the second between 1860 to 1890, and the third one between 1890 to 1914. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Great Britain were significant in the first two movements, while Mexican immigrants were significant in the end of the third movement. 1,901,000 people of Mexican descent live in the United States. After Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, he made no significant change in the immigration policy he inherited from his predecessor, Herbert Hoover. In the midst of anti-immigration popular sentiment, Roosevelt supported the immigration quotas established by the Immigration Acts of 1921 to 1924, but lacking Hoover's native seal succeeded in drastically lowering the number of deportations. By providing relief through the New Deal, Roosevelt decreased the annual number of deportees from nearly 20,000 in 1933 to fewer 9,000 in 1934, and maintained the number until the 1940s. As the Depression war on immigration into the United States declined significantly. That was in those days. Now, in these days, more than 1 million immigrants became legal permanent residents of the United States in 2011, and 14 came from Mexico, 7.9 came from China, and 6.4 from India. In 2013, Obama administration has removed nearly 2 million immigrants that came in 1930s.
The poor people were probably the most affected people during the Great Depression. More than 13 million people were left without work, which led to them being evicted from their houses or forced to sell their homes to the banks in desperate need of money. People were in such a great need of a job during the Great Depression that they traveled the whole country with just a little bit of money in their pockets and their families to find any vacancies in a factory or anywhere they could find one. About 1 to 2 million people traveled across the country in search for a job. Some of the most affected ones lived in New York. The homeless people that lived in New York used Central Park as a place to settle their houses. The largest Hooverville of New York was located in the middle of Central Park, near the abandoned Croton Reservoir. Unemployed builders took rocks from the reservoir and used them to create a shack that was 20 feet tall. A family even used a cave in Central Park as a shelter. In St. Louis, more than 1,000 people lived in hovels or Hoovervilles, made out of scrap metal and cardboard boxes. Hoovervilles is a popular name for the towns built by homeless people during the Great Depression. They could be found all around the country in almost, if not every state. Hoovervilles were made out of cardboard, tar paper, glass, lumber, tin, and any other material they could salvage. They were named after their president at that time, Herbert Hoover, who people blamed for the Wall Street crash. Source 10 displays how people lived and survived during the Great Depression. It describes how hard it was for people to survive during that time and how easily their homes could be lost. I consider it a reliable source because it was written whilst the Great Depression was happening, and it was witnessed or probably even lived by the author of the novel The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, from which the quote was taken out of. It was so realistic that the author was even awarded a Nobel Prize in 1962 because of the novel. The author does not seem biased. He is just explaining how tough the conditions to live for homeless people were. He was not taking either the poor people's side nor the rich people's side. Source 10 is also supported by the pictures of sources 8 and 9 that express the same ideas as source 10.